Hello everyone and welcome to this session of Angular Meetup Online. My name is Daniel Marin and I'm a software engineer at this.labs. Today's session is brought to you by this.labs in partnership with Norwal to give you the best meetup ever. So we're gonna have a few announcements before we start. So I just want to remind everybody that we also do meetups on React, Angular, Vue, GraphQL, and even RxJS. So please stay tuned. So soon we're having a new GraphQL fireside chat. We're going to be running this on May 12th. And then we're going to have a React Online where we're going to talk about the state of React on May 14th. And then we're going to have the View Online on May 21st. And then we're going to have another session of this Angular meetup on June 4th. So please join us on this.media in Twitter for more information or online events, blog posts, podcasts, and much more. So let's talk about our speakers. For today, we're going to have a Brandon Roberts. Sadly, Wes Grimes is not going to be joining us today, but we also have Mike Ryan here. We have Alex Okrushko. They're going to be talking to us about the NGRX State. So I'm gonna leave it up to you guys. You're in the spotlight now. Thank you, and sharing your screen, Mike.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the State of NGRX. My name is Mike Ryan. I'm a software architect at an industrial IoT company called Synapse, where I'm working on improving energy consumption for American manufacturing. I'm also on the NGRX team, and I'm a GDE in Angular and web technologies.
Yeah, and I'm Brandon Roberts, and I'm scruffy today, but that's okay. And I work at Narwhal, where we help large companies build applications at scale and teach proven development practices, including using monorepos. And I'm also on the NGRX team, and I'm here. You can follow me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts if you want to have some fun and hang around. So that's it.
And hey, I'm Alex Okrushko. Hey, I'm also on the NGRX team.
Wow,
Yay!
I can't believe it.
Bunch of people from the team. That's so cool. I work at Google as a software engineer. I work on the Firebase, particularly Firebase console. So yeah, I'm sure you all know what the Firebase is. If you don't, this is basically your backend for all of your mobile apps and web apps as well. So yeah, Mike, back to you.
All right. So we kind of want to give you an intro, a re-intro into NGRX today. We want to sort of reintroduce you to an old friend and give you a little bit of context about what NGRX was and what it's trying to become over the next year. So if you do not know, NGRX, the name comes from Angular plus RxJS. It was founded by, at the time, Angular team member Rob Wormald, and the mission was to build out a reactivity layer for Angular. So what does this mean? Well, we wanted to create a collection of libraries that improved the reactive programming experience if you were an Angular developer. And it started off with a library that kind of made us famous, and that's NGRX Store. In the very early days, what'd you say?
You mean infamous?
No. Very famous. At this point in history, the store was basically just a reactive re-implementation of Redux, which is to say that we wanted one-to-one compatibility with Redux, but to have the entire core of the library built with observables and to play nicely with Angular's dependency injection. Library number 2 that some of you may have used back in the day was the router. Brandon Robert gave a talk at NGConf this year on sort of the history of the NGRX router project. I really recommend watching that video. It's we'll give you a little bit more history than we're going to get into now. But the goal was to create a routing API that was pleasant to use, but also fully reactive. And then the third was NGRX DB. It was a reactive library that wrapped indexed DB's API that's available in the browsers. So you can kind of think of it as like super-powered reactive local storage. So these are the 3 libraries, but most of you are probably familiar with Store. So what happened to Router and DB? Well, Router got perhaps the biggest upgrade. It moved out of the NGRX project and moved into Angular proper. So Angular Router, the one you use today, its origins can actually trace back to that NGRX router.
That's why there's no Angular version 3. There you go.
That is true. The NGRX team is in part responsible for why we had to skip Angular 3. So you can blame us if you were caught up by that confusing version scheme back in the day.
I think about that every time I saw a guy that had a T-shirt on and said, "Where's my Angular version 3?" And it was like, well, he must not know the backstory. So now you know.
At the same time that Router moved out of NGRX and into Angular proper, Store really started to pick up in popularity. I think it became really popular for two reasons. First is that it was building on top of some really great ideas from the React landscape, right? We weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. We were borrowing concepts and proven strategies for state management. But the second reason it got really popular is that it was the only state management library for Angular for kind of a long time. And so for a period of NGRX's history, Store was sort of the de facto state management solution for Angular apps. So while supporting sort of the hyper growth of Store and helping move Router into Angular, unfortunately, we sort of had to retire NGRX DB. At the time, we were a much smaller, scrappier team, and so we had to be a lot more selective with our resources, and we decided to focus on these two projects and helping them mature. So from an NGRX perspective, that really just left us with Store. And it's kind of stayed that way for, I'd say, almost 3 years. To the point where when someone says NGRX, most people think about Store and our state management solution. But if you look at our history, that's not what we were aiming to set out to do. We weren't just a collection of state management libraries. We were trying to bring reactivity to all parts of the Angular experience. And so over the past year, we've begun to stretch back into our original mission and have begun expanding what NGRX is. And we're excited to share some of those details with you. But before we get into all the new goodness, I kind of want to step back and reflect on how the project has grown over the past year. So let's look at 2019 by the numbers. First, in 2019, over 350,000 developers visited NGRX.io. And those developers went on to download our NGRX libraries over 12 million times. Put in that context, that means NGRX grew by 30% year over year in 2019. That's really exciting for us. We're also seeing some pretty cool adoption inside of Google. Over 300 plus Google apps are now built using NGRX, meaning that almost 1 in 5 Angular apps inside of Google are now built on top of NGRX. And we didn't build this by ourselves. In 2019, we had at least 100 people contribute to the NGRX source code.
Shout out to the community.
Yeah, we could not have done this without the help from a few of our friends. And I want to mention a couple of them now. So first off is the NGRX team. It's not just Brandon, Alex, and I. We are also joined by John Papa, Rob Wormald, Tim DeShriver, Victor Savkin, Ward Bell, and Wes Grimes. And what I want to highlight here is that no one gets paid to work on NGRX. This is all volunteer work done in our free time with volunteer effort.
Whoa. What do you mean nobody gets paid?
I mean, you can pay us if you'd like to, opencollective.com/NGRX, but officially no one gets paid to work on NGRX.
I get paid in the number of actions written, so there you go.
5 cents per action? That's why good action hygiene has you write so many actions.
That's right.
Increases Brandon's paycheck. But there's a few new faces here. So in the past year, we've basically grown twofold. So we've added Alex, John, Ward, and Wes to the team. As Alex mentioned, he's a software engineer at Firebase and Google, and he brings a lot of great architectural mindset to our project and has really started to help shape the technical direction of NGRX. He's also the maintainer of NGRX within Google, and so he gets to share sort of this perspective of how NGRX is working at a scale much larger than the ones that we have access to. John and Ward brought us NGRX data, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then our last but not least newest member is Wes. He's a software engineer at Narwhal with Brandon. He creates a lot of great content for NGRX and spends his time helping developers be successful with the platform. Another thing I want to point out here is that everyone who got on the NGRX team did so by contributing to NGRX in some way, whether it's getting involved by helping us set the technical direction for the project, or writing docs, or creating great educational resources, or triaging issues on our GitHub repository. These people have made an impact, and that's how they have managed on this team. And so we'd really like to extend the invite to you. If this is a project you want to get involved in and feel passionate about, Just find a way to get plugged in, and maybe you can find yourself on that team one day. Also want to highlight, just for a minute, all of our great contributors. So these are our top contributors from 2019. NGRX would not have shipped nearly as successfully without the help of all these great folks, so we really appreciate it. Okay, now into the new stuff. So 2020 is the year of NGRX getting back to its roots. We want to start building libraries that tackle more of the reactive experience in Angular beyond state management. And I think the way that I like to think about NGRX is a collection of 3 sort of front tiers of reactivity. There's state, data, and the view layer. So let's jump in with NGRX State first. NGRX State is focused on providing an enterprise-grade state management and side effect isolation system for reactive Angular applications. It's composed of 5 libraries: store, effects, entity, router store, and store dev tools. And we're really excited because we just recently released version 9 to coincide with the release of Angular 9. So what's new? What have we added to NGRX State in the past year? Well, I think the highlight feature is the new creator functions that work to improve type safety and reduce code volume. So I'm really excited because Brandon's here, so I get to say this, but NGRX was legitimately full of boilerplate.
Oh, you just set that one up for me, huh? I see what's going on here. It's okay. I'll talk to you later.
And this boilerplate, it wasn't actually the boilerplate that a lot of people think about. Instead, it was really focused in the areas around creating actions and the amount of code you had to do to define a reducer, the amount of code you had to write to define effects. And so Alex especially sort of spearheaded this effort to create these new functions that reduce a lot of that boilerplate, a lot of that noise.
That's up to 4.
But at the same time,
it's up to 4.
How many times can you block me on Twitter?
We're about to find out. No.
Yeah, those are the good ones. And I guess I'd like to really say thank you also for Nicholas Jameson, right? Because his TS action library served like almost like a huge inspiration for that, to be part of an NGRX.
But what's really cool about these functions is they reduce boilerplate, but they don't sacrifice any of the benefits of the NGRX architecture. In fact, they improve the architecture by increasing the code safety both in your effects and your reducers. Let's kind of do some before and after pictures, because I think that does a good job of sort of showing just how much code we reduced. So this was the sort of minimum amount of code you had to author before NGRX 9, or actually even before NGRX, just before 2019. This is how much code you had to author to define just a single action.
Oh, that looks so great. I remember these days. Oh, so good.
Yeah, you had to have this enum that referenced all of your action type strings. Then you had the actual action creators, which we, at the time, were defining with these classes to try and get some type safety working. And then you had to have this union interface if you wanted to sort of do some powerful inference inside of your reducers and your effects. And it was a lot of code, and it was trying to do a lot of things. And these new action creators do a great job of reducing it down to just the basics. So now with create action, you can avoid all that noise and just focus on declaring an action. Here we're still specifying the type, we're still able to add metadata to our actions, and behind the scenes, all these other creators that we're about to show you will use some metadata on the thing that's returned from create action to improve type safety throughout your NGRX code base.
This is like 4 lines. I'm not making any money off of these actions anymore.
No, you're going to make more money because now that it's less code to write an action, more developers will write more actions.
Okay, I guess if you look at it that way. Okay, sure. Let's roll with it.
And that's actually one of the things that I love about it, about these new action creators, is with NGRX applications, we often advocate for something called good action hygiene. And as part of good action hygiene, we really want developers to write lots and lots of actions to give unique descriptions for every unique event that can arise in their app. And so by reducing all of the noise that it took to write an action beforehand, we think developers will be more incentivized to write more actions. It's a pretty similar story with reducers. So before 2019, this was sort of the minimum amount of code you had to write to author a reducer. And just from an educational perspective, trying to teach this posed a lot of challenges in terms of, why is there a switch statement? How is types flowing through the switch statement? What is that initial state initializer doing there? And it had some gotchas too. Like if you forgot to return or include that default case statement, you might run into some unexpected bugs. So the new create reducer function, again, really reduces a lot of that noise and gives you an API that makes it clear what exactly is going on inside of a reducer function. So you can see here, we're still providing initial state, but we're doing it in a little bit more of an ergonomic way. And now we have these handler functions where you get to declare which actions you're handling, and then you write a callback function that handles those actions.
So whenever somebody says boilerplate, I can just replace that with the word noise, right?
Yeah, noise and boilerplate are synonyms. I use the word noise so that Brandon doesn't block me. NGRX before 2019 was full of noise.
There you go. That's what I say when loud cars go by. I just say the inverse. I'm like, who's making all that boilerplate over there? Turn that boilerplate down. I can't focus.
It's the who invited Brandon to this?
Hey, I'm here just like you are, my friend.
So it's the same story for effects. With effects, it wasn't nearly as much code. This was already pretty compact, but there was some tricks that you had to kind of do to get these things to be as type safe as possible. Additionally, we weren't able to enforce some type constraints. So for example, it was pretty easy, you can see it in this example here, to write an effect that forgot to be dispatching an action. And we really wanted to surface good type errors here, and so that's where create effect comes in. Create effect replaces the effect decorator. Now it works as a function that returns the actual effect to run, and we can perform some really cool type safety. So now if you were to write the effect this way, NGRX effects could detect that, hey, right here on this line, you forgot to map the response of this HTTP request into an action. Make the refactor, add the map, and your code builds successfully. So what I would highly suggest is if you've avoided our set of state management libraries due to code volume or noise or boilerplate, I would really take another look at it in 2020. We've done a lot of great work here to reduce a lot of that noise and to help developers be more productive with the Indirect State architecture.
But the jokes are still going to be there. Don't worry.
In addition to reducing the boilerplate, we've also added strict runtime checks that are designed to help developers adhere to some of the architectural constraints that will help you be more successful with NGRX State. Just briefly, let's look over what NGRX now checks for at runtime. NGRX will now throw errors if you accidentally mutate state or actions out of the box. This helps you ensure that you're writing your state management solution on top of immutability. And immutability is great because that's what allows us to leverage things like on-push change detection strategy to increase the performance of change detection inside of our Angular apps. We also have runtime checks for serializability. So what is serializability? Well, it's just the ability for a JavaScript object to survive JSON.stringify and then JSON.parse. Basically, if you were to serialize an object and then parse it back out, does it equal the same thing, or is it roughly the same thing before you serialized it? And we see a lot of value in enforcing serializability because, if nothing else, this is what powers the Redux dev tools. With serializability, you're able to inspect the complete picture of your state within those dev tools, and you can dispatch actions from the dev tools back to your state management solution. Lastly, we have a runtime check for change detection. So there's occasionally, sometimes, the opportunity for you to fall out of Angular's zone-based change detection strategy. This could come up with effects or some interesting lazy loading strategies. And now if you try to dispatch an action that was dispatched outside of Angular zone will actually surface an error for you in the console. So you no longer have to spend time trying to figure out, hey, why did this action update state but none of my components rendered? We'll let you know something seems to be going wrong here.
Yep. Shout out to Stephen Cooper for putting that together. Actually came out of a tweet that he started.
Yep. So if you want to configure any of these runtime checks, you can do so using store module for root. So in the config for the root store module, you can turn off or on these runtime checks, depending on sort of what constraints you want to enforce inside of your NGRX application.
We like to call all those checks like hardcore NGRX.
That's right.
It was like NGRX Google edition or something. Everything strict all the time.
That's right.
See?
That's the only way to go.
So that's the update on NGRX State. Now let's talk about NGRX data. NGRX data is focused on abstracting the data needs of your view layer away from the mechanics of retrieving that data. Right now, there's only one library in the data collection, and that is NGRX data itself. And we'd like to say, welcome to the family. This was a library that was written by Ward Bell and John Papa independently of NGRX. And as they matured it out and vetted it and proved that it worked for some of their client applications, we made the decision to adopt that library into the NGRX family, where it now exists in our monorepo and is given sort of the same love and attention that all of our NGRX libraries are.
Still so it's still Ward and John's baby.
It is still, especially Ward. Yeah. I think Ward's one of the heaviest users of it, and it's fairly inspired by some of his previous open source projects. Yep. And so let's take a look at what that means. So the idea of NGRX data is to separate what the client needs in terms of data and how to retrieve that data. Let's take a look at a very simple component example here for a second. In this component, I have it using the HTTP client to get back a list of authors. And so what we could say is that in this component, the list of authors is the data that this component needs. And the HTTP request is the means by which that data is retrieved. With NGRX data, we want to sort of separate these concerns away from each other. Now, if you're a user of NGRX State, you might already know or have a sense of how to do this without NGRX data. First, you'd create some actions to represent entering the author's page and then the author's API successfully retrieving that list of authors.
Yes, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching.
Then you might go into that author's component and read out the authors from state and dispatch that interaction. And then you'd have an effect that would go and fetch that data. And this approach works great. You've accomplished the mission of decoupling what the data needs of that component are from how to fetch the data. But if you're building really entity-driven applications, you're going to realize pretty quickly that NGRX State may not scale well for those kinds of data-driven apps. And that's because for every entity, you kind of might find yourself following this pattern where you're writing the same sets of actions, the same sets of effects, and the same sets of reducers over and over and over again. NGRX data works to abstract away the mechanics of how data is fetched. So all those slides where I sort of showed some NGRX specific code, that's what NGRX data is trying to abstract away for us. So let's take a look at how we might do this with NGRX data. Here I'm going to author an Angular service called the author service, and it's going to extend something called the entity collection service base. This is something that you would import from NGRX data. Then you let the entity collection service base know that, hey, I need you to fetch authors. And it's going to automatically sort of figure out how to speak to your API, assuming your API follows some sort of best practices or some, what is the word I'm looking for? Some stylistic conventions. If you're following the conventions of NGRX data, then you can take the service, you can inject it in your component, and you can just read the list of entities off of that service and let the author service know, hey, I need you to get all the authors. NGRX data in the background, it's basically doing all that action reducer effect logic for you. It's built on top of NGRX state. And what that means is that you get the full benefit of reactivity and performance of indirect state without having to write a lot of those actions, reducers, and effects. And while it's built on top of indirect state, I want to point out that you don't need to use indirect state to make use of NGRX data. You can integrate NGRX data with any state management solution. It just so happens to be using indirect state underneath the hood for performance and code reuse. So that's NGRX data. Now let's get on to the newest frontier of reactivity for NGRX, and that's NGRX View. So with View, we're focused on bringing full-fledged reactivity to the component authoring experience. Basically, all of the parts of your app that are really communicating with the View layer, that's where we want to inject a lot of reactivity. We've got 3 libraries that belong to this frontier today, and none of them are released. In fact, 2 of 3 of these are still really in the design phase, but I'm excited to talk about them a little bit today. So there's NGRX Component. That's one we'll spend the most time on. But there's also 2 more. There's NGRX Component Store. Alex, do you want to give a little insight into what that one is?
Yeah, so this is basically a mini state management library that's completely separate from this global store. So it's a standalone library to manage component local state. It is a great use case for large components that have a self-contained state, or large shareable components as well. So this is all in the works. I'll throw the link into the chat where you can check out the design doc if you want to look over it. And the work on it basically started, the actual submitting it to the NGRX GitHub repo starts this week. So very looking forward to it.
And then the third one is NGRX.
For the end. I'm going to say my question's for the end for that one.
And then the third one is NGRX Router. Brandon, what's that one?
NGRX Router is a fresh take on building a reactive router under the new world of Ivy. We're going to try to get back to a couple of simple concepts of routing with components and building reactive APIs that you can implement and compose easily within your apps. So we're kind of rehashing the router again and taking, like I said, a fresh look at it to integrate that in with also.
Yep. But today I think we're going to share the most specifics on NGRX Component. So word of warning, we're really at the bleeding edge of NGRX. None of these libraries are published. And when it comes to NGRX Component, you can only really use it via nightlies right now. But nonetheless, there's some really cool things that we're trying to solve here. So the NGRX Component, we're really trying to rethink how change detection works for Angular apps.
Mike, how does change detection work for Angular?
Can you see my slides? Well, I'm so glad you asked, Brandon. Zone.js is the way in which Angular knows how to run change detection. So this is something that's kind of interesting, is Zone.js is not change detection. Zone.js is just the default mechanism that Angular uses to know when to run change detection. And basically the way it works is Zone.js patches all of the browser APIs that are asynchronous. And by patching them, it can know when your application code tries to consume one of these async APIs. And when the async operation is complete, then Angular uses that to run change detection. The problem here is that if you're using maybe really experimental web APIs, really new ones that haven't been patched yet, you're going to fall out of zones and change detection isn't going to run. Also, by patching a lot here, it might cause change detection to run more often than it should, resulting in a performance de-optimization. And so what we want to do is we want to think through, hey, if you're building your application fully reactively, and I've modeled all of my application state using observables, can I use the observable as a means to run change detection instead of Zone.js? And that's what NGRX Component tries to do. So the first API I want to highlight is a replacement for the async pipe. The async pipe comes with Angular. It's part of Angular's common module. And basically what it does is it subscribes to observables you pass to it, and it emits the values, letting you use those values directly in your template. But there's a catch with the async pipe. It does not run change detection. Instead, it just marks the view as dirty so that when change detection runs, it knows to update the view. So what we've done is we've built a drop-in replacement for the async pipe called NGRX push pipe. It has all the same behavior of async pipe, pretty much. There's a few extra bells and whistles, but the main idea here is that the push pipe will schedule change detection when pushed new values. So this is one of the first building blocks that might help you start to build an Angular application that does not rely on Zone.js for change detection. Because if you're modeling all of your application state using observables and you use the push pipe instead, we'll use notifications from those observables as the means to run change detection. The second API that I want to highlight tries to solve a problem you may have encountered before, which is if you're trying to use a value from an observable in multiple places in the template, you might run into a situation where you feel like you should maybe bind to the async pipe multiple times. For some observables, like the ones you get back from NGRX State, this is okay. But if you're using observables that are maybe returned from the HTTP client, without the right set of operators, you might be causing observables to execute more times than you expect, and syntactically, it's pretty noisy. Some clever Angular developers might know that you can get around this using the ngIf structural directive. So here I'm passing in author through the async pipe, and then ngIf supports this really nifty as syntax, letting me take the value that the async pipe has gotten out of that observable and bind it to a template variable called author, and then I can just use author multiple times. And there's a single subscription in play here, so there's no potential multiple executions to worry about. Finally, when I use author in my template, it's a lot less noisy in terms of that syntax. But there's a few gotchas with this approach. So first off, it's relying on the async pipe, which, as I said before, doesn't run change detection for you. But this strategy also breaks if the observable you're passing in happens to provide a falsy value, like false or 0 or null or undefined, because that's going to activate the logic of ngIf, causing this view to not render. So it's not suitable for all data that you might want to bind or express using observables. That's where NGRX Let comes in. NGRX Let's a drop-in replacement for this convention of using ngIf. You just pass in the observable, no async pipe needed, no push pipe needed, and then you can use a similar as syntax to take the values coming out of that observable and bind it to a local template variable. From there, you can just use that template variable in your template, and whenever the observable emits, we're going to schedule change detection for you. So let's recap that. The let directive unwraps observables for you, letting you use them directly in your template. And whenever that observable updates, we're going to run change detection, providing another great building block for potentially building Angular apps without Zone.js.
You know, what I really heard there was you're going to make the templates less noisy. What words?
Yeah, there's boilerplate everywhere.
Boilerplate in the templates? Ah, no wonder I felt so at home all this time.
So this is just the beginning for NGRX Component and our collection of Vue libraries. As Alex and Brandon mentioned, we're also exploring state management or local state management for components. We're exploring new router APIs, and we're really excited to bring more reactivity to the Vue layer. So that's our update on state, data, and Vue. If you want to learn more about these, of course, we're going to stay on and we're going to answer some questions, but also probably the best place to supercharge your NGRX knowledge this year is going to be at NGRX Conf. If it is safe and healthy to do so, we're excited to have this conference in November at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, the home of Space Camp, here in Huntsville, Alabama. You can learn more about this conference at conf.ngrx.io. While it's called NGRX Conf, it's not just about NGRX libraries. Like, we know that a state management library or a state management conference would put our attendees to sleep pretty quickly. So it's going to cover all things reactive Angular, not just NGRX. All topics are welcome. I'm really excited about it. If you'd like to check it out, you can use discount code Angular Meetup to get 20% off your ticket, and we'd love to have you there.
I think we originally called it Boilerplate Conf, but that kind of got shot down. So I think it's kind of catchy, though.
So first, shout out to our team. So Brandon, Alex, and I, we're not just the only ones on the NGRX team. We'd like to thank all of the NGRX team for all the hard work they put into these libraries over the past year. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Breebug, Zedware, Oasis Digital, Narwhal, even some individual contributors like Lucas Rubelkey and Deborah Carrata. Your financial support has been a tremendous help over the years. And also thank you to our community for supporting us, for inviting us to your cities to speak, for contributing to our documentation, our code base, and help make these libraries great. So with that, we'd love to spend some time and answer your questions.
Thank you, Mike, Alex, Brandon. I loved it. I hope everybody enjoyed it as well. And so if you have any questions, you got them right here for you. So go ahead. There's any questions, we're going to be reading out the comments. And also, I want to say thank you to our sponsors, Brandon, to This.Labs and Narwhal for bringing us this event to all of us. And well, thank you all of the others seeing this too. All the audience there, thank you very much for being here. Go ahead, Brandon. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no, it's good. Get that Narwhal plug in there. But yeah, one of the questions that I saw was, would you use NGRX data and state together? And I guess I'll throw an answer in there if somebody else wants to answer too. Yes, you can use them together. NGRX data, like I said, is built with NGRX state under the hood. So the places where you wouldn't use NGRX data the places where you would use NGRX data would be like to manage your entities, or if you have a lot of data, if your app's very data driven, a lot of collections, like standardized APIs, and you use NGRX data for that. Then you can use NGRX store or NGRX state, as we call it, to manage like the other pieces that are more tailored and have different use cases. So you can use those together.
All right. Another question that I see: when are we targeting the release of the 3 new libraries? Brandon, do you want to answer that?
Tomorrow, no.
So
don't release on Fridays, kids.
Well, we probably won't be targeting all 3 to release at the same time. They all will be released when they mature enough that we feel comfortable in them, that the APIs are stable and we are basically comfortable for everybody to use them. You can always grab the night list if you really want to experiment, and we've seen a number of people already did some experiments. Like Mike Harrington played with the component, NGRX component, in a few videos I've seen. So we won't be, so there's no set dates yet. No set dates yet.
I think NGRX component is probably the earliest one to go, since it's already there and our people are already trying it. We're more or less right now trying to ironing out the API and making sure that the test and documentation and things are there before we consider it ready to go out for initial release. So then the other ones will follow along at some point when we get those together.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm still, like I said, we're still hacking around on the router one. So if you check out my talk from ngconf in the GitHub repo, I'm still hacking around on that for now. But yeah, we'll become a thing at one point.
Thanks for the question, Nathaniel. Yeah.
Question from Robert Osel. First off, hey Robert, how are you doing? He wants to know if anyone on the NGRX team has used XState and whether or not it sort of fits in with the goals of NGRX. So Tim DeSchryver has actually used XState the most, and he's written some great blog posts about XState in particular. So if you just Google Tim DeSchryver XState, you'll find some pretty good content. And I really share his opinion on this, which is that XState, which is a library for describing state machines, is really, really useful to describe component logic. And so I suspect there's going to be some really cool use cases of mixing XState along with NGRX component store. But it's probably too early to tell what that would look like.
All right. The other question is, will NGRX push and NGRX let in a separate package? Okay, the functionality is useful. They are in the same package, right? So, but you can use whichever one you want. it should be fairly small, I guess, package. But it kind of grew bigger than I think we would like to. But yeah, they are in the same package, and so for right now, it's not separated. We'll see how we can optimize to make it even smaller.
And then there's a comment about it following on to that question of feels like these are things that should be in Angular. And maybe they should be in Angular, maybe not. I think the NGRX team, now that we've grown and matured out our processes and our publishing strategies and our design process, we see a pretty cool opportunity to maybe be the reactive extensions for Angular that we always set out to be. So we'll see how that evolves over time.
Yeah, pretty soon you're gonna have like Angular Core and then like NGRX, and then is that a hot take or no? I'm not saying it's a hot take. I'm just it's a dream maybe.
There's a question somewhere about I use Switchmap, and is there any gotchas with using Switchmap? Oh yeah, Bill asked that in the example in the slide for an effect. I saw usage of exhaust map. I've always used Switchmap. Any gotchas there? Yes, there are some gotchas with Switchmap. So Brandon and Alex, you've heard this analogy a couple of times, but I always like to fall back on my post office example. So there are 4 mapping operators: merge map, exhaust map, switch map, and concat map. And let's say that the 3 of us went to the post office, and we all had to get some packages shipped off. Well, with merge map, if Brandon, Alex, and I went into the post office, we would both swarm the postmaster at the same time. And there's no real guarantee about which of us the postmaster is going to finish helping first. And so you can kind of say there's maybe a race condition. You don't have a guarantee of order there. With Switchmap, if this is my favorite way, this is the way I wish lines worked for me. With Switchmap, if Brandon was in line at the post office and I showed up behind him, I would just like push him out of the way. He would never be helped. He's gone forever, and I get to get my package taken care of.
Of course you like this line instead. Of course.
But again, there's a chance of a race condition there, right? You don't have a guarantee that everyone's going to finish. Brandon never got his package shipped off. I just completely pushed him out of the way, and he was ignored for forever.
Oh, I'm waiting for you outside. Don't worry.
Exhaust map is a more traditional post office experience. If I show up to the post office and Brandon's already in line, I'm just going to turn around and leave because I know the post office takes forever and I'm not waiting in any line.
That sounds like
again,
angry. That sounds like angry Mike that's ready for lunch or something.
Hangry Mike just showed up. I'll meet you outside too. But again, there's a chance for a race condition with this one because my package being shipped off was totally dependent on whether or not Brandon was in line. So with switch map, merge map, and exhaust map, you have the potential for race conditions. And you need to be very careful about understanding how those 3 operators work to avoid any gotchas that those race conditions might introduce in your app. Concat map is the way that lines typically do work. If Brandon was in line, I would just get in line behind him. I'd wait for him to finish, and then I would move on and get my package taken care of. It might be slow. If you have a lot of people waiting in line, it might take a long time. You might get some sluggishness in your UI, but it's super safe. Everyone's package is going to get shipped. It's great. So if you're going to look for one operator to use forever, I would say concat map, and then reach for the other 3 when you understand some of their trade-offs.
I always use Switchmap. I don't know why we're like recommending concat map. What do you mean? All my applications are like type heads. I'm just saying.
I just like exhaust map. Why it was like, why do you even come and you stop bothering me while I'm working on this already? Yeah?
This is why we can't have a style guide.
Yeah.
We got like 3 different opinions from the team.
Another great question. Oh, good question from Kate. She's asking, any tips on mixing the old syntax and the new? My answer to that is we went to great lengths to make sure they both could be interchangeably used within the component, within effects or anywhere else, really. And you can slowly start moving all your your libraries to the newer syntax. So yeah, no problem there. It's not all or nothing. You can slowly, gradually move in.
Yeah, you could definitely mix the 2 together, and I have done it. It's a little more involved, so I would probably stick to one or the other, but you can mix them together. You have to reach for some relatively unknown APIs in NGRX store to kind of get the types to fit together. But yeah, I have come across the need to do that anyway. If you're working with like a legacy AngularJS app and you need to push some actions over or something. So, yeah.
For the next question, I want to point out that Eric shouted out Brandon BP Roberts. I love that. It's now his new middle name. That's sticking.
Jeff Cross has already like taken that. He's already called me that a couple of times. He started like Brandon Boilerplate Roberts and what was the other one? It's like Brandon Barbecue Roberts or something like that.
It just works.
It just works.
There's a question from Lance Finney. First off, hey Lance, nice seeing you. Hope you're doing well. He asks, I have one app where I replace all the state one of my features with a combination of data and router store. So nice. But then he also had a question about we recommended using NGRX data for 50 plus entities. What about for simpler solutions? Yeah, so NGRX data, it's a full-on data access object for REST APIs. It abstracts away a ton of that logic. And that abstraction, we didn't kind of get into any of the trade-offs in this talk, but there are trade-offs to using such an expansive abstraction. It's important to understand what the trade-offs of that abstraction are before you choose to use it. But there are probably plenty of apps smaller than 50 entities where it makes sense to use NGRX data.
Let's see.
Somebody asks, what about the strict Google and GRX? Strict Google and GRX. So what we mean is that
let's talk about hardcore NGRX.
there's at Google we use the TypeScript at the strictest level possible. So that already enforces some of the things that we want from state management library. That's actually how I got involved because I was pushing some of the requests upstream to the Mike and Brian at that time and asking for, hey, can we do this? This is broken, or if this is not working exactly as we need it.
Can we like tighten up these handcuffs a little bit?
Yeah, and they're like, hey, okay, yeah, that's great. Why don't you submit that? And slowly just got part of the team that way. Yeah, so I think that's what we mean. There's no really that much different. We do like a lot of advanced JavaScript optimizations like property renaming. So that also enforces certain rules and basically eliminates a lot of libraries that they're not really strict in that kind of land. But yeah, there's not really that much out of it. There's not much guide to strictness.
There was a spicy question from Robert. When will we be able to use NGRX on our React, Preact, Vue apps? This is, I think, been a conversation that Brandon and I have had from time to time. We can see its value in big shared code situations where maybe at the enterprise level you need to share some code across multiple apps written in different frameworks. If that is a really predominant use case, it might be something we'll explore in the future. If that's not why you want to use it, I would really recommend the Redux toolkit. They've done some pretty cool things recently where they've borrowed some of our APIs. Of course, we've been inspired by the Redux team for years, so we've borrowed plenty of their APIs too. And I think an NGRX developer, especially as it pertains to state management, would feel right at home with the Redux toolkit.
There we go. I wouldn't be, I guess, in GRX Meetup without this question. Your personal opinions on using facades for removing component awareness?
Oh, no, that's a spicy question.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's a spicy one.
Go time.
Are you using that pattern or not? And why not? I'll let you two do this because
facades help me go to sleep at night.
Brandon and I have a talk called The Facade of NGRX Facades, and it's kind of a joke title, but not so jokey, where there are some pretty strong best practices in NGRX that we really recommend you adhere to, like using selectors exclusively for data transformation and adhering to good action hygiene. And we have seen developers that use facades start to veer away from those best practices because facades encourage some different approaches to that. So I'd recommend checking out that talk, The Facade of NGRX Facades. We kind of walk through, hey, if you really want to use facades, you've got a good reason to do it. These are some things you really need to keep in mind if you want to be successful with them.
Yep. Yeah. On a serious note, if you're going to use them, you still need to keep the good action hygiene rules in the front of your mind, because that's really going to kind of guide you on how you use them and how you take advantage of selectors. Let's see. Any more spicy questions in here?
There's one that are there any plans to automate the migration from old syntax to new syntax?
Yeah, there have been a few efforts to do that, but with so much like variation between the ways you could do it with the old way, the good way, there just wasn't a consistent way that we could offer like a migration from the old syntax to the new syntax. You'd end up putting your app into a broken state just because you have to like find all the references. And if you're using like constants for your strings, and then in addition to like the enums, there just wasn't a way that I don't think it was a way to satisfy enough people. So we're more or less stuck to, if you're doing it the old way now, stick to that. And then as you start to build new things, use the new syntax, because they can cooperate together. So that's kind of been our stance on it.
Along those lines, if you happen to be in a situation where your code base did have an old style but used it really consistently, I would use that as an opportunity to learn some AST transform tools. I know at my company, that's what we did. We had a very strict internal style guide for our NGRX actions and reducers and effects, and that made it possible for us to write some automated refactoring tools of our own. It didn't take that much code. It was just kind of a big barrier to entry in terms of learning experience. Once we learned it, we were able to write that code and make the transformation ourselves. So don't be too intimidated by it. It is something you can learn and apply in your own code bases.
I 100% agree with Mike there. And we also had the internal style guide for this specific. For example, we didn't use enums for actions types at that time, right? We were using strings and stuff like that. So we did have also that, and that also helped move all over like the Firebase consoles and Google Clouds and a few other libraries by somebody who volunteered to write those transformations. And yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, just whatever you're doing, make it consistent.
Yeah,
and then that makes it so much easier to write your own automated refactoring tools. You'll really thank yourself later for that. I love NGRX plus Firebase too, Eric.
That's right. NGRX plus Firebase is fire. Is that okay to say? Let's see. There was a quick another question here. Do you know why NX Console does not use NGRX? I don't know if that means internally or like the NGRX schematics, but NX Console does have support for using narwhal schematics and using the NGRX schematics library for generating or scaffolding files out. So there is some support for that there, if that's what you mean.
That's an interesting question. Are you planning on adding some runtime checks to detect and report action dispatch cycles? I assume this is where you can, by accident, right, make a loop of all the actions that we dispatch. Yeah, that would be an interesting feature to look into. I don't think we had any plans on that.
We decided to keep that foot gun in there for the people. Seriously, yeah, this one has been on I think on our radar for probably as long as effects have been around. As soon as probably everybody's done this at least once. You write an effect and then you didn't mean to dispatch or you're not dispatching anything back, and then your browser closes and you wonder why. But yeah, that has been on our radar. And one thing that I proposed, well, in addition and along those lines with effects, is to provide basically to push more information into the Redux dev tools about where the sources of those actions are coming from. So maybe if we have that, then maybe we could build on top of that to kind of notify you that that the action that you dispatched was the same action that came out when it shouldn't be. So it could be something that we could get to down the road, since we don't have an official like NGRX dev tools today to kind of help you along with that. But yeah, Robert Osell said it's a rite of passage, and that's right. If you haven't locked up your browser at least one time using effects, I mean, like, really, what are you really doing? You're doing things the right way?
Or hit a rate limit on an API.
There you go. We're gonna dispatch the same action 50 times. We're gonna close our browser, and then we're gonna go to lunch. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, you always see in these like RxJS. Like, I don't know if you see them as much anymore, but like RxJS is a stream, it's a cycle, it's a perfect circle. And it's like, yeah, it can be.
It actually is
a little too perfect.
It's more perfect than you want it to be. Let's see.
There's a couple of questions about Narwhal's data persistence module. For instance, should we always use index data persistence, or are there some specific use cases for it? And Brandon, I think, as the resident Narwhal employee,
there you go.
You get to answer that one.
Yeah. So what data persistence is basically a standard way to, like we talked about before, having those race conditions around common use cases. And the index data persistence service and the data persistence operator help you guard against those things. Like the fetch library will make sure that the actions that it processes are still in the right order, and uses like concat-map underneath to, like I said, ensure that they're in the right order. But it makes sure it guards against those race conditions that you may have when you're doing optimistic updates or pessimistic updates, or if you're routing based on like navigation. It gives you basically guardrails to ensure that you're not accidentally like shooting yourself in the foot. So you can use those operators with just vanilla effects if you want to, outside of using the data persistence service itself, because both of those are exported as part of the Narwhal Angular package in the public API. So
there's a question from Tanya. They asked, always been curious if there's some way to explore selectors I've missed in dev. The number of times I've created my selectors and just log them out to the page in the async plus JSON pipe. Any tips? Well, first of all, the async plus JSON pipe tip is a pretty good one. I don't think a lot of developers know about that. So if you are looking for a way to just inspect a stream, using the async pipe and then the JSON pipe from Angular Common is a pretty neat way to get some inspection. But beyond that, no, there's really not a good way to get introspection into the data graph that your selectors create. I think it'd be something that I'd be really curious to see someone tackle. I think there might be an opportunity here for some dev tools or something like that.
I keep hearing NGRX dev tools get mentioned here some kind of way. It just keeps coming up.
Someone should build them.
Actually, we had this visualization of that graph built a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And again, that's because we had
actions were great.
Yes, it was a little bit hard, right? So our intern wrote that visualizer, but it was visualizing the code itself, not not a runtime. So it was creating the graph for it. And I've seen somebody else recently also created a similar tool. I've seen something on Twitter.
Yeah, I've seen it too. His name fails me at this point. Gregor.
Yes.
Yep. Gregor. He wrote a library. They wrote a library that visualizes the flow of actions through your effects and through your reducers in your application. Yeah, he wrote that, and I'm trying to think of what the name of the library is. I will try to look it up here while we're talking. It's called NGRX-Viz. Mm-hmm. And I will post a link to that in the chat room. But yeah, it's a visualization tool for actions, reducers, and effects that you can run. Like I said, it's not at runtime, but it's still at build time, or you run it at compile time, and it generates in like basically a small app for you to let you visualize that.
There's a super quick question about what about NGRX plus GraphQL. Go to if my friend Sam Julien and I just started a series on Twitch today. We recorded the first episode. You can watch the recording of it, exploring NGRX plus GraphQL. So check that out. We'll be trying to do that every couple of weeks or so. I'm releasing a new chapter in that series.
Cool. Do we have time for more questions, or are we?
Listen.
You can answer a few more if you want to.
Yeah, let's do like 3 more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you just answered the one about NGRX and GraphQL, right?
Yeah. There's a question: is it wrong to just use new on actions instead of store.dispatch? I.e., what advantage does dispatching have over just newing it? So newing an action or creating an instance of an action shouldn't do anything. That just creates an instance of an action. Actually, dispatching is what's going to cause that action to flow through all of your reducers and then flow through all your effects. So that's sort of the difference between those two mechanics.
Okay, there's another question. Any plan to update the example app for feature on lazy loaded modules and share NGRX entities?
And the new creator functions and...
What? The example app does use creator functions.
Yeah, they are.
Yes, we are. This is another one of those things. If you ask the 3 of us what our opinion is on the example app, we're going to give you 3 different answers. So we're still working on we're actually thinking of redoing the example app in a way that's more modern and kind of gives the best recommendations based on all of our opinions.
Yeah,
So
I think we wrote that example app like in the hotel lobby for NGConf 2015 or 2016, like in a Sunday afternoon, and then it's just been kind of like twisted and
then the community gets along and says, "Hey, we'll take this and we'll add some more things into it and contribute some stuff to it." But yeah, we have talked about redoing that to make a better example that people can use as a reference.
I will say that we've avoided doing a style guide in the past, but I've Deborah Carrata and Duncan Hunter are working on updating their Pluralsight course on NGRX. And I've been having a lot of conversations with them over the past 2 weeks or so. And they've been asking me, like, hey, what's the best practice for this? What's the best practice for that? And I've just had to come up with answers based on some experience. And there's, I think it might be time to take those answers we've given and bundle them up and start seriously looking at a style guide.
Yeah. We, of course, I'll just say this. Yes, we can. Even if we put a style guide out there, we can iterate on it to, kind of mesh the things together.
Yep. Yeah, we have again also we have an internal style guide for basically anything, be it TypeScript, be it like GRX even, just because it helps us to be familiar. When you go to a different part of the code base, either Firebase or even other products, because it's one monorepo, and to be comfortable with it, understand what's going on, or even, for example, I maintain this library within Google, but what does it mean? It's not installed every time from npm. Actually, I have to manually sync it myself into the monorepo, and then everybody else gets the benefit of the updated version. But also for me to make it easier to sync it, if everybody has their different kind of uses of it, for me, there'll be very much a problem to update all of the libraries that are using it in GRX. So for that reason alone, it's also very helpful to have like a style guide that we follow. But again, we formed something that works for us, I feel like, based on, again, our experience as well. So
yeah, and you'll have one. Synapse has one. I'm sure Narwhal has something like it. We just kind of need to throw them all together into a pot, boil them, let it simmer for an hour, and see what comes out.
There you go.
I'll take one more question. What do you think about Akita? I think Akita is awesome. I think NGXS is awesome. NGRX tries to be like the bare metal, super performant, enterprise grade state management library, and that makes it really unsuitable for a lot of Angular apps and a lot of Angular developers. So it is really, really great that the community has other options these days that might better serve their specific use cases and needs. And it's really cool that they all have reactive APIs. You can use libraries like Akita and NGXS with our new NGRX View libraries.
I like the way you snuck that in. I think that's a good note to end on there. Good libraries, reactive Angular. Let's go.
I think we're ready. So thank you guys for answering all those questions, giving your opinions, giving your updates. Knowing from you directly it's very cool for us as a community to learn directly from the creators, the maintainers. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining. Don't miss our coming events in the future. We do this. We do also React, Vue. So no matter what you like, we trying to do something for you too. So thank you and bye.
Bye. Hope you have a great day.
Bye.
See ya.